sure. But if you don't understand a concept, I would recommend that you also look it up online. You can find a lot of information when you look these things up. You can find different sources, different ways that the material is explained. So kind of keep that in mind if you're having trouble or not quite understanding some of this material. So I'll start with some of the landmark studies. Framingham, this was an interesting study. They studied a group of people that lived in Framingham, Massachusetts, and they've been studying them for a very long time, since 1948. So they've been looking at what they've been doing, and it really kind of goes to show how important it is when you set up a study design, because they were able to look back at things when they found new things they were interested in. So one of the questions they asked was about basic physical activity. It wasn't very in depth, but they did ask something. So as these people got older and these people got heart disease, you could go back and see, okay, well, we think exercise is involved. Let's see what's going on there. So a very a pivotal study, and it really showed, for one, from your perspective, the importance of really how you set a study up, as well as it gave us a lot of important information associated with exercise and general health. The Aerobics Center longitudinal study, this was out of Dallas, Texas. It was the Cooper Clinic. It is what a lot of the American College of Sports Medicine data is derived from. So they're not really collecting any new data, but they are looking at, they still look at data that has already been collected. There are some issues with this data. For one, it's Dallas, Texas. It's not necessarily representative of the country as a whole. It's just a small microcosm of people, and most of those people are fairly well educated, because the Cooper Clinic was a clinic that people went to, and it was kind of a gym as well, where they could get exercise testing and they could exercise, and had a medical component to it as well. So it was a lot of great data came out of it, but it is really just generalized and localized to the Dallas, Texas area. So it's this data set is not without its flaws, and that's going to be true for all these data sets. You have the Nurses Health Study that looked at thousands of women. You had the Physicians Health Study, which looked at thousands of men. And now the number of nurses is still dominated by women. There's a fair number of men in the field, but there's a lot more women still in the field. Physicians, though, the numbers are more even, as physicians, doctors that are graduating from medical school. But this was these studies occurred many years ago, so at the time it was predominantly women in nursing and predominantly men for the physician's health. You also had the Harvard Alumni Study. Again, all these represent people that are well educated. I would say generally white. The minorities, there may be some representation of minorities, but it's not a true representation of minorities that we see in the population. Then you have government reports. These are good and these are free. You can find them online. You have the Surgeon General's report from 1996, which is becoming a little bit dated now. And you have the Physical Activity Guidelines from 2008. So those are good government sources. In exercise prescription, we talked about the ACSM guidelines. Those are something that you can go off of as well. So this is how activity is defined. It's important to kind of read these and memorize these. Inactive, no activity beyond baseline. So these are the individuals that are sedentary. Low are people that are exercising, but they're not meeting the guidelines. Medium are people that are actually meeting the guidelines. So they're not doing a high amount of activity. They're just meeting the guidelines. So, and then you have high, which is over 300 minutes of activity a week. So that medium range, people kind of think of people that are meeting and exceeding the range to a moderate amount, 150 to 300 minutes of moderate activity. They think of those people as medium. So you don't have to do a lot of activity to get into that medium range. And the high is over 300 minutes of moderate, I'd say 150 minutes of vigorous. The World Health Organization, looking at the global diet, physical activity, and health objectives. Their goal is to reduce risk of chronic disease. So on a global level, we're trying to reduce the risk of chronic disease. This is not just an American problem, not just a problem in the U.S. It is a worldwide problem. So even in underdeveloped countries have other problems as well, but really all the countries now are having issues with chronic disease. Increased awareness and understanding of chronic disease, develop, strengthen, and implement global, regional, and national policies and action plans. So what are we going to do to decrease the risk of chronic disease, and monitor science and promote research? So this study, or rather this information, this is from Healthy People 2010. Healthy People is a government-run project that they develop objectives for every 10 years. So now we're on 2010, or excuse me, we're on 2020 rather. Once 2020 rolls around, they'll review how the objectives were or were not met, and then they'll create new objectives for 2030. And the key here that I want you to take away that they mentioned in the text is none of the targets were met. The text says that, or hypothesizes that the reason for that is there's no national plan to reduce or to increase physical activity, reduce sedentary behavior. And it still doesn't seem to be on the government radar from a health perspective as well. So we have some basic terms with epidemiology. We have incidence and prevalence. Those are different. Depending on the disease state, one may become more important than the other, and rate. So incidence is the number of new cases within a given time frame. So if we're looking at infectious disease, if we're looking at the flu, we want to know how many new cases of flu there are. There's not that many people living with the flu. You have the flu for a couple days, and then you don't have the flu. So, and you get better. So in the case of infectious disease, especially things like the flu, we want to know how many new cases there are a year. And when they talk about flu rates being high, they're talking about the incidence rate. As opposed to prevalence, prevalence is the number of people living with a disease, and that becomes much more important from a chronic disease perspective. So if we're looking at heart disease, diabetes, obesity, to a certain extent, yes, it's interesting to know how many new cases of heart disease and diabetes there are each year. But it's more important to know how many people are living with these diseases. So that is looking at the prevalence rate of the diseases. How many people? So when they talk about the flu rate, the number of people with the flu, they talk about the incidence. When they're talking about number of people with heart disease, diabetes, they're talking about the prevalence rate. So rate is the number of cases divided by the average population size. So with a crude rate, you have no adjustments. With a specific rate, you're grouping by subcategories. You might have a minority group that has high rates of a chronic disease state, but they may represent a fairly low part of the U.S. population. So you want to make sure that you're giving a specific rate to see what exactly is going on in that population. Standardized, you're adjusting for other variables to make a valid comparison. So if you're looking at physical activity rates, you want to standardize for diet, to see body weight, things like that, to see, okay, what are you looking for, and trying to take the other variables out so that the information that you have is true and not spurious. So this just provides a whoops. Oh, come on. Illustration of direct and standardization is just showing crude rates, and then what happens if they're adjusted, giving you that information. So relative risk and the odds ratio, these things are similar, and they'll be talked about again with the study design. So the relative risk is the ratio of the incidence of disease in the exposed individual to the incidence of disease in non-exposed individuals. So if you have a risk factor, what is the likelihood that you are actually going to get sick? Again, this will be important from a study design perspective because relative risk is important when you're trying to predict the risk an individual has. So if somebody has high cholesterol, what's the risk of getting heart disease? In that case, they'll look at relative risk. Odds ratio, they're looking at people that are already sick. And they're looking at if you're sick, what's the chances that you have one risk factor or another. So it's slightly different from your perspective. A lot of times they're at least in your mind, they're interchangeable. From a technical perspective, they are different, but from a practical perspective, so from a technical perspective, they're different, but from a practical perspective, they're very similar. They can be very similar in many instances. So when we're looking at study design, we're looking at the independent variable. That's the intervention often, the variable that is not changing. And you have the dependent variable. I'm sure you already got this in research methods. The variable that is examined and will be affected by the intervention. So if we're looking at diet and exercise would be the independent variable, and then weight or risk of disease or things like that would be the dependent variable. You also have natural history, and you're observing a variable over time. So these are the different study designs: cross-sectional, case control, prospective, cohort, randomized control or randomized clinical trial. This breaks down the different study designs and what are the benefits, the advantages, disadvantages. Also, how are we looking at these things via time? So for a cross-sectional study, we're looking at a snapshot. So we're looking at risk factors and disease outcomes, but we're looking at it at one point in time. For case control, we're inquiring about the exposure to the risk factor. So you take a group and you start following them and see who gets sick, who doesn't get sick. It takes more time. Prospective study, you assemble a cohort, assess the risk factors, and here you're looking at more than one individual. So from a case control, these people are already sick, and you're looking at individuals that are the cases, and then you're comparing them to a group that you have deemed to be as similar as they can be to the group that has the disease. So they'd standardize for things like age, gender, race, ethnicity, where you lived or where you live, things like that, to try to develop another group that's similar to the group you're trying to look at. Prospective cohort, the individual has a certain factor, and you're looking at those individuals forward through time. So you're seeing, okay, if you have this risk factor, are you going to get sick or are you not going to get sick? So ideally, in those instances, you would also have a comparison group, a control group, to see, okay, if you don't have the risk factor, what's going on. So for things like a smoking study, the prospective studies, prospective cohort, as well as the case control studies were very important. So from a case control perspective, you're looking at the people that got sick and got cancer, especially lung cancer, were they smoking or not smoking? As opposed to a prospective cohort study, then you would take a group of smokers and non-smokers. Nobody has cancer yet, and you're following them forward through time and seeing, okay, who gets sick, who doesn't get sick. And then randomized control trial or randomized trial, that's where you introduce an intervention. And especially for unhealthy habits, it's very difficult to have a randomized trial. You cannot take a random group of people and say, okay, this group, we're going to have them not smoke, and this group, we're going to have them smoke. If you know or you believe that smoking is bad for you, then it's hard to, or it's unethical, immoral to say, okay, this group, we're going to give them something that may increase their risk for disease. And that's where the randomized clinical trial is really the best study design, but sometimes it's just not feasible, especially when you're looking at negative health behaviors. You can't implement and tell people or from a research perspective to engage in behaviors that your hypothesis is that this will get the individual sick. So then the next part of cross-sectional, the advantage is it's easy and quick. It's appropriate for hypothesis generation. So if we wanted to give a survey to the class, how many people smoke, how many people don't smoke, that would be a cross-sectional study. There's no time or temporal relationship between the risk factors and the disease, and it's not appropriate for hypothesis testing. It's more appropriate for developing a hypothesis. Case control, it's appropriate for the study of rare events. So if you have a rare type of cancer or rare disease, it's easier just to find the people that are already sick with that disease and then look back retrospectively to see, okay, what is different about these individuals versus the control group. You can study multiple risk factors. It's inexpensive and quick to perform because you're looking at people that are already sick. You're not following them. You're not following a healthy group through time and just waiting for somebody to get sick. You're already dealing with people that are sick. The disadvantages, you cannot determine absolute risk. There's subject recall bias. You can study only one disease at a time, and the time relationship is uncertain. So the recall bias is saying, okay, let's say you have memory difficulties, and it's a group of 50-year-old, 60-year-old individuals, and they say, well, have you ever had a concussion? And then because you ask that specific question, they might, or did you ever fall and hit your head? An individual might think back and say, okay, oh yeah, this is when I hit my head. Whereas if you ask them with no other context to say, have you fallen and hit your head? They might not answer yes to that, depending on how significant of an event it was. But when they're trying to find associations, people might become a little bit more likely to say that they've had one event or another. The cohort study, it provides an absolute measure of risk, allows the study of multiple disease outcomes. The problem is it's expensive and time consuming. You got to wait. You need to wait until somebody gets sick. That takes a long time. So if we wanted to look at illness in this class, in this cohort, it's going to take some time before people get sick. It'll take time for them to become sick. So these things you might have to study for long periods of time. You lose people and can access the effect of only risk factors, obtain a baseline. So you have to make sure that you ask the right questions at baseline to validate your hypothesis. The randomized control trial, that's the best, and that's where you have two groups. There's nothing wrong with them. They're relatively the same, as similar as you can get them, and then you introduce an intervention. And then you see what are the outcomes of that intervention. That's great for like a short-term exercise trial. It's great for drug trials, things of that nature. But if you're looking at is a person going to get sick, you're going to have to look for you're going to have to wait for a long time. So it's the same issue with a cohort study where you have issues of time. The difference between cohort and randomized control trial is that in the cohort, these individuals are not randomized. They are engaging in whatever behavior or risk factor automatically. That's what they're doing. However, in a randomized control trial, you're instituting or implementing whatever behavior you want that to be. So if it's the use of a medication, then that's fine. If it's use of exercise or better diet, those things are fine and those things are good to evaluate. But if you're looking at an unhealthy habit, it's the cohort and case controls are going to work better. So this kind of breaks it down and gives you a little bit more information about it. If you have questions about these different study designs, my recommendation is to look this information up online. You could also ask me. You can post information or questions on the general discussion board. I'm happy to answer them and address them. However, a lot of times you can find some pretty good examples online that help kind of explain it to you. And I'm there for you. If you have a question you want to ask me, I'm happy to address it. But there's also other ways to get at that information as well. So you do what you feel is best for you. Uh, okay, so uh, we're looking at the prospective studies, the incidence rates, the risk different, the attributable risk uh, versus the relative risk. And so what's the risk that's associated with that specific risk factor that you're looking at? Uh, and just note that you always, whether it's relative risk or odds ratio, you always have a reference group of 1. So if you're looking at sedentary behavior and the sedentary behavior is a reference group of 1, then the individuals that are exercising, you would expect their relative risk to be less than 1. As opposed to if you took highly active people and you looked at, you made them the reference group of 1, then when you're looking at less healthy people, their relative risk is going to be greater, so it's going to be a number greater than 1. And that's what I'm trying to say in this example of a value of 4 and 0.25. They could mean the same thing. It's just a matter of which one is the reference group. So for case control, we use odds ratio because we're looking at not who's going to get sick, but we are looking at people who are already sick and what were their odds of getting sick. The big issue is for the confidence interval for these variables, you want them to not cross 1. If they cross 1, then that means that this risk factor can either increase their risk of disease, but it could also potentially decrease their risk of disease. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. You want that value for it to be valid to be something either greater than 1 or less than 1, and not include 1. Attributable risk, the incidence rate in the exposed minus the incidence rate of the unexposed divided by the total incident rate in the group exposed, to see how much does that risk factor really play into whether or not the individual is going to get sick or not. And the same can be done with the odds ratio as well. The population attributable risk is the incidence rate in the total population minus the rate in the unexposed divided by the incidence rate in the total population. And the population attributable risk, this becomes important with examples like what's worse for your health or what's worse for the country. Is it smoking or is it obesity? And smoking, as you saw from the previous slides, it increases your risk more than any other single risk factor for all your chronic disease health outcomes. But there's less people smoking than are obese. So obesity may not be as bad as smoking, but because more people are obese, the population attributable risk is greater than it is for smoking. So you're looking at, from a population perspective, you're not just looking at how bad is this risk factor, but you're also looking at how many people have the risk factor as well. So you have diagnostic testings, you have what is called sensitivity and specificity. These are the keys that we're going to look at. We also have these terms of true positive, true negative, false positive, false negative. Whoops. One of these is incorrect. We'll find it out in a second. So true positive, people with the disease who have a positive test. So as we said with the functional movement screen, if it's positive, that's a bad thing. That means that you have the negative outcome. You have the disease, you have pain, whatever it may be. So true positive is that the people who have the disease actually test positive. True negative is the people that do not have the disease test negative. But then you have the false positives, the patients with the disease, without the disease who test positive. So I don't have the disease, I'm not sick, but when I do the test, for whatever reason, it says that I do have the disease. So if you're a woman, you get a mammogram done, and they find a nodule or something in there, and then they send that to biopsy, and they say it's not cancerous. So the initial was a false positive. You did the mammogram, and it showed positive that you have something wrong, uh, and then that would need further evaluation. So that would be so you really didn't have anything wrong with you, and this is a big issue because then that provides a lot of stress on the individual, extra medical testing, extra costs, and we're trying to mitigate that. So we're trying to find the true positives and the true negatives. We want those to be as good as they can possibly be, and we want the false positives and false negatives to be as low as they could possibly be. So a false negative is that the person has the disease, but they test negative. Uh, so this is a real big problem. So if you have cancer or you have a chronic disease and you test negative, then you're not getting the treatment as quickly as you can. So false positives lead to excess stress, increased medical care costs for the individual and the provider. But the false negative means that, hey, you've got something wrong, and now you're not getting treatment in necessarily a timely fashion. So that's a major problem as well. Bayes' theorem, the odds of having or not having the disease based on the test results and the prevalence of the disease. Likelihood ratio, likely of positive and negative. We'll skip those. Sensitivity is the probability of a positive test if the diagnosis is positive. And specificity is the probability of a negative test if the diagnosis is negative. These things are important to try to see, okay, to try to accurately diagnose. So you want the sensitivity to be high and the specificity to be high as well. I'll mention reliability here, reliability and validity. Reliability means that you're getting the same result time after time after time. Validity means that your result is true. So validity and sensitivity to a certain extent would kind of go together. Validity and sensitivity and specificity would all kind of go together. Are the results that you're having true? So this kind of breaks down sensitivity, specificity. So you can kind of play around with these numbers, and the false positive becomes a major issue. If you have a lot of false positives, yeah, you're finding the people that are sick, but you're also giving the people that aren't sick a lot of treatment and heartache and issues that may not be good for their health as well. And you're looking at this on a population basis. One thing that you'll realize with all of these, and that's what I want to show in this slide and the next slide, is that there's a lot of factors going on. So trying to figure out what is the major factor or the major problem is sometimes difficult. So things go together. It's hard to necessarily tease things out, and sometimes when you tease things out, you start overcorrecting, and now you're washing out the effect that something may have had. So if you're looking at healthy lifestyle, people are probably, hopefully, they're engaging in good eating habits, they're engaged in physical activity, they're engaged in mindfulness, meditation, things like that, maybe spirituality. All those things may be working together so that the individual decreases the risk for disease, or if they do get sick, they increase the likelihood that they will get better. However, how much of a factor is each one of those variables, and trying to tease those things out becomes tricky to see. Okay, how much benefit is one specific type of behavior. A lot of interrelationships, and again, with a healthy lifestyle, it's difficult to find people that smoke, drink, eat poorly, but then exercise on a regular basis. These things are going hand in hand. I would kind of assume that the people that are exercising are also eating better and not smoking and not drinking, or at least not drinking excessively. There's no guarantee of that, but that's kind of the issue that you have, is that the interrelationship is strong, and how much of a factor is one over another. So this is what becomes confounders. One cause that affects another. So physical activity and blood pressure, when looking at heart disease, both of those things will affect your risk of heart disease. Add up multiple risk factors, and you may wash out the effect. So you start controlling for everything else, and then it's difficult to see what exactly is the relationship, because these things are working together. Effect modifier, two factors independently may not have an effect, but when added together, there may now be an effect. So one of the examples there is smoking and birth control pills, and stroke rates, especially in younger women. Smoking alone does not greatly increase the risk of stroke in women, and birth control pills alone do not greatly increase the risk of stroke in younger women. However, if you put those two things together, then yeah, the risk becomes much, much greater. Causation and correlation. Be careful with these terms. When in doubt, I would recommend going with correlation rather than causation. Causation is difficult to prove. You need a clinical trial, if not multiple clinical trials. You need to show that this, whatever you're looking at, is increasing your risk of the disease, and it's nothing else. And that is difficult to prove. And this was a big issue with smoking, because what the cigarette manufacturers would say is that there's no causal link that's been found between smoking and cancer. And that was because of what I mentioned earlier. It's unethical to get a random sample of individuals and tell them that they must engage and develop a smoking habit. It's unethical. So by virtue of that, it's going to be impossible to ever show causation. Now, the other factors associated with determining causation have been validated, so now we do say that smoking causes cancer, but it's very difficult, and it takes a long time before you could say that. Now, it was very easy to say that smoking is correlated with cancer, because you saw a lot of smokers that were getting cancer, whether you looked at it prospectively or whether you looked at it from a case control perspective, where you looked at people that had lung cancer and how many of them smoked. So that correlation was much stronger and was much easier to demonstrate, but the correlation was much more, the determining causation was much more difficult. And sometimes correlations are spurious. So when we look at height and intelligence, there is a relationship between height and intelligence. Taller people are smarter. But what we're not taking into consideration, we're not taking into consideration just the general population. We're not taking into consideration just 20 to 40-year-olds, where their height stays relatively stable during that time. If you're a baby, your height's going to be much shorter. If you're an elderly adult who has cognitive issues, you're shrinking, they're going to be shorter as well. So there's no relationship between height and intelligence when you're looking at a group of 20 to 40-year-olds. But if you're looking at it through the spectrum of the whole population, you will see a correlation there. But it's a spurious correlation, so it's a correlation that really doesn't mean anything. Mills canon, so these are the things that you need to observe to show causation. So you need a temporal sequence, so that's a time sequence that X happened before Y. The individuals were smoking and then they became sick. It's not that they became sick and then they engaged in a smoking habit. So you could say that with, let's say, opiate use and cancer, the temporal sequence would kind of be reversed. The individuals got cancer, and then they developed an opiate habit, or they were on opiates on a regular basis. But that's because they had cancer, and they were trying to manage pain, as opposed to people that are recreationally using opiates. So the temporal sequence X happens before Y. What's the strength of the association? So is it, and with smoking, the strength of the association was strong. With other risk factors and diseases, the association is much, much weaker. Consistency, do you see the same result over and over and over again? Dose response, if you do more of X, is it more likely to have Y? So if you smoke more, you're likely to get sicker sooner. And biologic plausibility, is there a mechanism by which this risk factor has its effect? So when we look at exercise and diet and smoking, alcoholism, we can, to a certain extent, figure out biologic plausibility. Why is exercise beneficial at the biologic level, at the cellular level, at least the systems level? And there are things that you can do to determine that, and there's things that people have done to determine that. So you have to determine a mechanism for how this is occurring. So doing all those things aren't necessarily easy. And for some, it's difficult to do that randomized controlled trial. So, but if you cannot do a randomized controlled trial, then you could look at these variables from an observational perspective to see is there an instance where you could say that one risk factor causes another. But again, when in doubt, I would say go with correlation. So that's it.